thanks everybody for being here this morning. I don't know what the time culture is like in Singapore these days. We tend to run on the academical quarter hour. It's not exactly the German system, but that's the best case explanation. I also want to preemptively apologize for the variety of quasi-holidays and semi-holidays that today. I'm new in town, I've only been here a couple of years, and I'm still trying to get a handle on is today really a holiday or not. And so I really appreciate the fact that you've taken time away from your work and your families to be here. I think by now I've met almost everyone, but if there's anyone here who hasn't had a chance to chat with me this morning. I'm Charles Waldheim, Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture. On behalf of the Graduate School of Design and Dean Mohsin Mustafavi, welcome. Thanks for being here. We have a minor tradition in the modern era here of colloquia, discussions, informal chats in advance of what will likely be a search process. For the last couple of years, what we've been holding conversations like this here at Stubbins so as to inform ourselves, educate ourselves, and to educate our faculty, colleagues, and students about areas of research that we're interested in. This is the third of these. The first we did was on landscape history. We are on the cusp of a press release on 2 searches in landscape history that we'll be able to announce in a couple of weeks. This past year, we organized a discussion on geographic representation, GIS, critical GIS, geodesign, etc. That's a search that's ongoing just now. And we do have an appetite to do more in the area of digital media. And so we thought we would gather together a range of interesting designers and thinkers on these topics. The format is meant to be discursive and conversational. It's meant to be chatty. It's not meant to be formal. I do know that those of you that are speaking and responding have spent quite a lot of time preparing for this, so I appreciate that. But anything that we can do to inform our process going forward, that's the idea. And so we've asked each of you to help advise us on what's the state of play right now in digital media and landscape architecture, and where do you see the field or the subdiscipline going in the medium term? And of course, along the way, you'll be using your own work and the work of others to illustrate those tendencies. I want to say briefly just two words on my own stake in that question, just to get us started, and then I'll introduce Stephen Irving. It occurs to me, at least from my own limited vantage point, that in the last half century there have been 2 dominant international paradigms of landscape representation. That's a broad claim, but I'd be willing to unpack it if anybody wants to pursue that. One of those broad paradigms began more or less here, the GSD, in the 1960s. It was deeply computational. It was ultimately influential internationally. It had to do with a group of people founding the Laboratory for Computer Graphics, using computational engines toward the problem of mapping both social, demographic, cartographic information, but also natural and environmental information. That paradigm came to change the field globally. It's still with us, and yet for many of us, it's become a kind of intellectual cul-de-sac. Not because it hasn't been really influential and adopted internationally, but primarily because it's based in a positivist view of the world, in which we have increasing knowledge that we can spatialize through maps, and yet we seem to lack the political economies and the political will to actually interpret much of that data. Many of the projects that I consult on, I find that we have actually more data, better spatialized than we had 50 years ago, and yet we still seem to have difficulties with the hermeneutic side of all that data. So we have one paradigm that Harvard has a stake in historically. It produced, among other things, GIS. It's been internationally influential. It's built industries, changed the way that we see the world, and yet at the same moment doesn't seem readily available for us going forward in critical or unmediated. Arguably, a second major paradigm emerged in the late 70s and early 1980s. It bubbled up in the English language in places like Bedford Square, London, and Philadelphia, maybe Columbia University in Australia, New Zealand. Largely speaking, it had to do with a reappropriation of the historical avant-garde, looking at practices of collage and montage, and it had to do with the uptake of architectural thought into landscape architecture. And so if you were a landscape architect in the 1980s, if you were interested in the kind of critical position that architecture could afford you, you might have been looking at collage and montage practices from the teens and 20s, trying to appropriate some of their criticality. I've argued elsewhere that that was largely an analog. It's rubber cement and paper. It's really an antique practice. It's not digital. And yet we see those practices today. They've been reproduced globally as a kind of cliche, and they have now come to be absorbed by generic digital off-the-shelf media, the Adobe packages and the like. My position in this, just so you know, is that neither of those traditions going forward can really help illuminate work advancing the field. They both persist with us. One is intensely digital, the other less so. One has a kind of positivist scientific basis, the other has its basis in critical theory. Both of those traditions are available for recuperation or reinterpretation or revision. And at the same moment, I'm convinced that for landscape, we could imagine in the course of the next decade a truly immersive digital experience, much as in the way that architecture has been revolutionized. Now, I don't want to get out ahead of that, I don't want to be teleological about that. But for our purposes here in this building, we've been, over the course of the last 2 years, in a fairly rapid pace, trying to reconsider the role of digital media relative to landscape pedagogy and landscape practice. 2 years ago, when we arrived here, we were slightly surprised to find that there was a prohibition against the computer in the first year of our program. We had a single digital course. It was a week on Adobe, a week on AutoCAD, a week on Grasshopper, and students told me that they knew less at the end of that term than when they began. And so we've been in this experiment over the last couple of years here, trying to both come up to speed with our colleagues in other disciplines, but also look at our peer group internationally. And so this event today, this conversation, is really meant to inform us in a highly practical way about where do you see the field going, what kinds of discourses, what kinds of practices should we be looking at and investing in if we have an appetite to do more in that space. So welcome, thanks everyone for being here. What I thought might be appropriate as a way to open is to invite my colleague Stephen Irving to characterize the history of digital media and landscape architecture at the GSD. Since I could make some stuff up, but he actually knows this history and has lived much of it. Stephen is, in addition to being director of our computer research group, lecturer in landscape architecture, and has had quite a hand in the relationship between digital media and landscape architecture here over many, many years. So, Stephen.
Thanks, Charles. So, welcome. Charles asked me to do this, and I dusted off a talk that I gave a few years ago called 30 Years of This, and I realized that I could quite justifiably now call it 50 years, which for some of you is older than you are, and for some of you might be thought of as half a century. And for me and you, it's 5 columns of 2 minutes each this morning. Arguably, this whole business starts back at MIT with Ivan Sutherland and the invention of his piece of software and hardware, as you can see here, an immersive environment called Sketchpad. Sutherland was right there at the crux of just when it was possible to control electrons on a screen with an electromagnetic pulse, and actually designed not a mapping system, but a drawing system. He was very interested in drawing in 2D and 3D, and like many of these kinds of stories, he was quite visionary about what this could become, but he was constrained by the hardware that surrounds him. And almost everything that you see in modern CAD was anticipated and even described by Sutherland in his early work. At the same time, approximately in the 60s, Carl Steinitz came to the GSD under the directorship of Hideo Sasaki. And almost immediately, Steinitz started to work in this paradigm of mapping, which was under development by Howard Fisher here at the early Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis. But Carl, too, started with a 3D drawing environment. This is work that's actually taking symbols, describing them mathematically, and placing them in 3D space under computer control. Both of these things were, of course, very bulky, not even punched cards, mag tape, and that sort of thing that led to this kind of thing. Carl's name continues right across for these 50 years. And I will take some liberties with the columns and the dates and the names throughout the rest of this. But that this was a very formative time in the invention of this notion of the laboratory for computer graphics and spatial analysis. A lot of seeds were planted, which in the subsequent decade took flower in a kind of an interesting way that actually branched in both of the directions that Charles just talked about. The dominant piece of software here, and as elsewhere, was something called SIMAP, and you can read many of the various published histories about this, but this was the thing that made these kind of line printer maps that were characteristic of the earliest time, raster representations, in a sense. And at that time, a number of people who were students here at the Graduate School of Design, notably Jack Dangerman, and there's a list of other names, but they went on to found, for example, ESRI and ERDAS, and develop the software that became parts of the sort of industrial standard, status quo, state-of-the-art technology for many people. You all know where you are? That's the peninsula of Boston at a suitably coarse representation. That's this column there. And here at the Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis, a number of people working were thinking about, at the time, the topological complexities of how do we unpack two-dimensional representations and be able to do things like overlay and clip and combine and extract and all of those geographic operations, topological operations, and spatial analysis operations that informed the development of GIS. And certainly at the same level, the set of problems here are exactly the same problems mathematically as the so-called hidden line problem, which had to be solved in order to make perspective representations possible, so that you got foreground occlusion of objects in the back. And taking all these line segments and doing the mathematical operations, there was quite a lot of hard work, and the standard texts from the time are all about the matrix transformations necessary to move the 3D coordinates around so that you got the desired effects that you needed along the way. I became aware of this image pretty early on. The U.S. Forest Service was, at the time, in the 70s, I entered a master's program in 78 at UMass Amherst. And the U.S. Forest Service at the time was the largest employer of landscape architects in the country. I don't know if that's still true, but I wouldn't be surprised. And they were aggressively working on the problem posed by some legislation that said that you've got to consider visual impacts of operations.
I think it's either AECOM or Gomjani.
that are now the largest employers. Yeah, I think that's probably right. This image, I think, is astonishing in a way for the depth of its spatial message transmission and its economy of means. There's frankly just a whole bunch of these symbols that are a straight line with a couple of triangles on it. That's all you've got to work with here. And yet it's both a terrain and an ecosystem and a climatic representation all together. And this was work done on line printers and mainframe computers and complex analyses of, this was all, by the way, mapped to camera lenses. So they go and take pictures in the landscape and know the camera position and lenses and so on. And this was in the air in the 70s when I entered school. And then the 80s here at the GSD were characterized by the SIMAP became replaced by the map analysis package for landscape architecture students. Every landscape architecture student encountered this. in Carl Steinmetz's course, Theories and Methods of Landscape Planning. And the map analysis package was really Dana Tomlin's packaging of the basic ideas that he had learned, plus a very important set of contributions of his own that was his PhD, and his contribution to this was this understanding of the so-called map algebra, that you could add maps together and get a map, or multiply maps together and get a map, and the logic that follows from that. And there were a number of other people here at the time, Dennis White, who went on to the EPA, Bill Mitchell, who came in architecture and was critical in sort of the creation of the computing environment here at the GSD. And another outsider, does anybody know Alvy Ray Smith? Alvy Ray Smith went on to found Pixar, and he was the principal mathematical artist behind it. And Smith and his colleagues published this image in the 80s, which I saw, certainly, absorbing these things in Light magazine. And this, I think, is probably the first 3D, completely synthetic landscape, other than the US Forest Service that I just showed you, that anyone had ever seen. And this is the kind of thing where a team of scientists worked on the then developing fractal technology for weeks to do the rocks, and another team worked on the reflection over here, and another team worked on the atmospheric haze, and another team worked on the little forsythia shrubs that you see over here. And it took 48 hours to render on a frame buffer, and it was like 4,000 by 4,000 dots, because they were already thinking that they were going to make movies using this technology. And so we've continued, both the GSD landscape architecture, the field in general, has continued to absorb things from Hollywood over time, and we certainly owe them I entered the story here with my Apple II computer, and the first encounter I had with the GSD was I came to a conference of the Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis in the early 80s, and I gave the keynote address by an accident, which was supposed to be my mentor Bruce McDougall, who at the last minute couldn't come, and described my own work, which at the time was using the high-resolution card on the Apple, which was 320 by 200 dots, and the color, which was, of course, either black or green. And I was already trying to take the technology that I was learning to hand sketch and understand what that meant in this new interactive digital environment. And when I came here to the GSD, Bill Mitchell had recently arrived, and we were thinking about and created really the set of both policies and technologies that made the rich, complicated multimedia, digitally enabled studio environment that you see in the trays upstairs, where digital media were one more piece of the package, along with cardboard and clay and trace and all of the other parts. And you walk upstairs now, you will see how that has evolved, and the work in the lobby out here, you'll see how that has evolved. And I can't leave without mentioning Dana Tomlin, who has been at Penn for some time now, whose idea of the kind of logic of mathematical but also logical operations on maps as a way of understanding environments was certainly formative in this whole thing. And my very first courses that I taught here were together with Carl using this sort of raster GIS technology. My job was actually, my first coding operation was to add color to what was up to that point still line printer type maps on this software. The 90s then, suddenly there was all kinds of commercial software available. We already had MacGIS, the sort of follow-on to map. Photoshop became the killer app for everybody, as it sort of pretty much remains today. There was already AutoCAD. Mitchell McCulloch and I were teaching Pascal to every architect and landscape architect as the coding environment for parametric variations at the time. And a number of people, my colleague Paul Cody became responsible for the strictly GIS side of this exercise. I mentioned my colleague Hope Hasbrook, who was a student at the time, took a course, and I'll mention her name again in a moment here. That was a time of really the primacy of AutoCAD, and certainly until AutoCAD stopped working on the Mac, which was sort of mid-early 90s, it was, other than Photoshop, the killer app in this environment, and it was really the foundation for people's understanding of representational tools. And the ability to draw contour lines that were interpreted by a laser cutter absolutely transformed the making of models, to be sure, right? I mean, we traded X-acto accidents for laser frustrations in a way. That you see examples of that outside. The principles of rendering and the ability to manipulate texture maps and reflectivity was sort of possible on the desktop by that time, what we inherited from Alvy Ray's exercises. This was an exercise by Hope as a student here, thinking about the white cedar swamp forest and one of the kind of impressionistic sides of her larger analysis of that environment. We had a couple of colleagues from Toronto, Rodney Hoinks and others, who were using the SGI supercomputer of the time, combining digital GIS information with also image processing operations and indeed animation. So this was a time of quite a lot of productivity in the course that I taught, called Trees, Rocks, and Rivers, or Virtual Gardens, different manifestations. And it was a time when we were really just trying to get a handle on all the different ways of representation that were appropriate for landscape architects in a range of their activities, and that led in 2001 to Hope Hasbrook's and my text in this matter called Landscape Modeling, and you can still find it at landscapemodeling.org on the web.
Is that a pitch?
There's a pitch.
At the turn of the millennium, then the possible pieces of software continued to explode, of course, as you all know. And fortunes came and fell in this period of time. There was a wide range of the kinds of things that were possible. My own duties moved more into administration and less into teaching. People like Will Martin and Scott Melbourne and Andrea Hansen and others, whose names I probably omitted, but through no ill will, led a whole, really, this decade of productivity in just a dizzying array of kinds of software technologies that were applicable as landscape architects, engaged with planners and architects in using the standard tools of architectural representation in new and interesting ways. And indeed, the collage, the digital collage, became, and I will claim still is, the sort of premiated representation. We turn out incredible Photoshop artists in this environment, some more and some less, but there's a complete range of constant experimentation in this regard, and both a set of conventions and a set of constant inventions as well. And then finally, where we find ourselves again, the total quantity of software available, I would argue, hasn't actually grown that much. I was hoping to draw kind of an exponential curve here, and I realize it's kind of flattened out a little bit, but with variation, so that now, you know, we have Grasshopper on top of Rhino instead of AutoCAD and AutoLisp, and we have all kinds of movement in this regard, and indeed, yet more and more complexity, and people like David Ma, Lyra, Sylvia, and others teaching in the curriculum have started engaging our students in all of the use of that. And so now, the sort of state of the art is a very facile integration of GIS kinds of information, scientific and ecological kinds of process information, 2D and 3D image representation manipulation, and the sort of quintessential collage technology. And most recently, I would say the fascination with both algorithmics on the one hand, and with CAD-CAM or rapid prototyping, 3D physical manifestation modeling has combined in very rich and fruitful ways, especially around the question of topography. And this has also become a kind of a standard convention for our students in the manipulation and creation of objects that are landscapes. And this sort of intersects nicely with the current fascination in architecture with blobby, curvy surfaces and the kind of ambivalence about building versus landscape and the ability of 3D printing to make almost any form that we can imagine it manifest and possibly subject to analysis and other kinds of representation. So the rest of you are here today to tell us about what the future holds across this set of considerations of platforms, software, hardware, people, media, ideas, and so on, and I definitely look forward to it. I want to end with two final slides. One, a small set of kind of summaries of what I think we've gotten to here. The collage is still the primary preferred representation, along with spaghetti, and that's a technical descriptive term, also sometimes slightly pejoratively applied, to vectors that don't carry much additional information other than their 2D coordinates. And we see a lot of such drawings. They don't have a constant 0, 0 reference, so it's impossible to place them in the world. They often don't have any other addition other than what we can see. And one of the great contributions of the Lab for Computer Graphics and Spatial Analysis was exactly to unpack spaghetti and show the benefits that came from unpacking spaghetti and adding enough information, metadata, data, attributes, and others that you could make sense of and further analyze these lines other than to look at them. And that's, I think, a problem that we still have a lot of opportunity to grow in. Those two, I think, quintessential, fundamental, cognitive design operations called variously sketching and different, I claim, but often interrelated diagramming, are still, frankly, not very digital. That's not something that's very easy to do, as most of us know, and the fluidity with which tracing paper and colored pencils are manipulated is just not yet reached by what my colleague Malcolm referred to as trying to draw with a rock in your hand. That despite the availability of pens, something that our friend Ivan Sutherland had to begin with, and that has been reinvented, in the last few years with pen computing, and the possibilities open to us from gestural computing on the various tablets and so on, which are really exciting, and I look forward to them as transformations in interface. They still don't engage the cognitive complexities of these two activities, and so there's deep, deep research. Frankly, analysis and simulation across the range of things you might care about, whether it's carbon footprint or thermal performance or simple cost or speed of evacuation or whatever you want, is hard. It's not easy to integrate with the activities of drawing and modeling. Again, something that the lab wanted to talk about, and one of the benefits of adding these attributes is so you can begin to do these kinds of things. It's hard. We don't see much of it. There are some spreadsheets. There are occasions where we've had some engagements with analysis and simulation software, but this is a room for a huge area of growth as far as I'm concerned. Algorithmics, programming, or making macros is on the rise, which I think is fabulous. Whether it's Pascal or C++ or Grasshopper, doesn't matter. The idea that we're able to actually engage the expressive opportunities of programming is, I think, really exciting, and I hope to see more about that. The distorted grid is an obvious place to start. That's repetition and conditions. Those are the two things that you need to have a programming language, and once you've got them, you can begin to do some interesting things, as we've seen if you look around at the work. And dynamics are beginning to be engaged, however tentatively, and this also is fabulous. In my course, I always talked about three kind of attributes of this dynamics. One is movement through, and so that's the walkthrough. And the 3D Max or other kind of animation, which is now also state of the art, and almost everybody can manage to do it in almost every software. Makes it pretty easy to do. But it's still static objects that you're moving through, and maybe changing some lighting. Then there's movement of, and that's more interesting, more complicated. It's leaves blowing in the wind, or tides rising and falling, or cars moving around. That's in some ways easier, and in some ways a whole lot harder to control, and certainly the videography of controlling that is hard and rich and still a really important part of things we need to have more of, in my view, in the representations of the landscape. I've always argued that one of the things that computers did was not make drawing easier, but making it easier to represent those things that are frankly hard to draw, like motion. And then finally, the characteristic of interaction with as the form of dynamics. That is things that change when you touch them. Landscapes that change, whether they're real or virtual or otherwise. And this is the whole world of sensors. I'm sorry, this got to the bottom below your knees over there. Sensors on the one hand, more than just satellites. We've had them for a while. And what other kinds of sensors can be of interest. And then the flip side of that is actuators, things that actually change and move in the landscape. And that's something I hope to hear more about today as well. And finally, my prescription for the future of this enterprise is wrapped up in this word, geodesign. In my view, this is a kind of a hybrid of CAD and GIS that incorporates object-oriented representations, a complete range of design methods and operations, scientifically informed simulations, multi-factor analyses, time-based dynamics, algorithmic interfaces, interdisciplinary collaboration, linked multiple levels of abstraction, and multimedia visualizations, including impressionistic collages, videos, immersive virtual realities, analog artifacts, and other things we don't yet have names for. That's the future of digital. LA.
Thanks very much, Steve. Very, very helpful. I wanted to suggest that in addition to, there's plenty of oxygen and furniture over here on this end of the room, and Stubbins is meant to be a kind of colloquial, familial kind of space, but people will be coming and going. So please find yourself comfortable. So in addition to Stephen's kind of prehistory, you've seen outside in the Gund lobby this platform exhibition. We at the GSD in the Modern Era have done this platform show now 4 times. It's meant to be a survey of the year. It's highly edited, and it is of the school, and it has each of the individual core courses as well as some of the options and some of the other things going on. So the combination of that history plus some of the presentations you'll hear today, as well as the show outside, should give you a little bit of a sense of the state of play today and where we are. With the idea that there have been these 2 dominant paradigms, one of which was intensively digital and that Harvard had a formative stake in, the other of which was highly critical, yet not so digital, both of which I would argue came out of landscape architecture very fundamentally. I would also argue that neither one of them really allow us the kinds of critical engagements on the topics that we think of as fundamental and probative in the field today. In that space, we, for the sake of just beginning this conversation, have provisionally penciled out these four thematics. I want to disclaim up front, I apologize for the damage those themes do. I don't think any of you fit comfortably within them. They are inadequate. There are overlaps between them. My goal is by 5 o'clock to have essentially rendered them obsolete and to replace them with the kinds of thematics that we really should be focusing on going forward. Having said that, whether it's responsivity, fabrication, relational or associative modeling, or the sensory media question, those are rubrics that seem on the table for setting our discussion today. And so as a way of beginning, we thought we would start with sensory or time-based media. That's, of course, something that could occupy us for many, many days and weeks and months, and we've got an hour and a half. And so what I want to do is I want to introduce to you Sylvia Benedito. You know Sylvia by virtue of the fact that she's actually organized this whole thing, and I just showed up, so thank you, Sylvia, for doing that. Sylvia is, among other things, a Portuguese-trained architect. She did her urban design training here at the GSD and has been working in the field of landscape architecture as an urban designer for many, many years. She joined us as an assistant professor fairly recently, and her own research looks at time-based and sensory media. Sylvia.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm with my back to most of you. So I'm introducing this session dedicated to sensory landscape, a theme that will very much navigate in between art, landscape design, and technology. Just a brief note on the structure of each session. As Charles said, we're going to have 90 minutes. For each 20 minutes, are going to be dedicated to each speaker, followed by a brief summary and comments from our respondents. And then we'll open the session for Q&As and for discussion with the audience. It's a pleasure for us to have 2 distant speakers, Jörg Pekitke and Joshua Mosley, to help us to inform our thinking on the field of sensory media in relation to landscape architecture. And the respondent of this session is Chris Reed, also a professor here at the GSD. Jörg is an associate professor and director of the Master of Landscape Architecture program at the Department of Architecture, School of Design and Environment at the National University of Singapore. He's a landscape architect, a skilled nursery gardener, and holds a doctorate of engineering. After his studies at the Technical University in Berlin and École Nationale Supérieure du Paysage in Versailles, he worked for 10 years at RWTH, Aachen University, initially at the Department of Landscape Design, and later at the Department of Urban Design and Regional Planning. After he worked for 2 years as a chair of landscape architecture, University of Wageningen, in the Netherlands before he moved to Asia in 2008. His teaching and research focus on landscape architecture in the mega-urban context, geodesign, and unorthodox approaches to digital tools for landscape design, visualization, and modeling. His presentation here today is entitled Foot Soldiers of Geodesign. Our next speaker, Joshua Mosley, also he taught at GSD last year. He's an artist, a professor, and the chair of the Department of Fine Arts in the School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania. He received his MFA and BFA from the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago and his AA from St. Louis Community College. Joshua is recipient of the Rome Prize, the Pew Fellowship in the Arts, and the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Awards, and the Pennsylvania Council of the Arts Fellowship. His work has exhibited and screened at the 2007 Venice Biennale, at MoMA, New York, the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, the Museum für Gegenwartskunst in Basel, Switzerland, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Bruce Museum in Greenwich, Connecticut, the Reina Sofia in Madrid, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, etc., etc. His presentation here today is entitled Sensing Movement, Shaping the Time-Based Experience of Landscape. And finally, wrapping up some words about our respondent, Chris Reed. Chris is Adjunct Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at GSD and Principal and Founder of STOS, Landscape Urbanism, based in Boston. STOS has been distinguished itself internationally for a hybridized approach to public works project rooted in infrastructure, functionality, and ecology. STOS is a recipient of the 2010 Topos International Landscape Award in recognition of the, and I quote, theoretical and practical impulses the firm provided to the advancement of landscape architecture and urbanism as dynamic and open-ended systems. STOS was also named a finalist in the landscape design category of the Smithsonian Copper Hewitt Museum's National Design Award in 2008 and 2010. And he has been selected as a finalist and winner in a number of international space design and planning competitions, such as the Airy Street Plaza in Milwaukee, the Lower Lands in Toronto, and the Safe Zone Garden Installation at Burnaby in Quebec, Canada. STOS was also named a 2008 Emerging Voice by the Architectural League of New York. Reed's research interest includes infrastructure and urbanism in the contemporary North American metropolis, in a recent focus on LA, the recalibration of engineering and infrastructural technologies towards an expanded and hybridization notion of landscape-based urbanism. So please welcome our speakers and respondents. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. What you see here looks like a cool, like a boat, a raft boat. You see this sofa-like installation here in the background. But it is not a boat, it is a toilet. So it is a floating toilet, and what you see here, it's going under, it's sinking, because when we are working on it, those buoys are coming, and there is too much load, and it's sinking. That's why you see me here as an escaping foot soldier. We are working on this toilet raft because we are documenting it as the lowest point on the territory, and we are building 3D models of it. I will explain why we are building 3D models of the toilet raft, but what you see here is the result. There are holes in it, so it's not perfect. It's ongoing work, especially the holes in the middle here, because of the water, because the water reflection is not generated well enough. This toilet is in the middle of a mega city, more than 20,000 people, Jakarta in Indonesia. We are working on the Ciliwung River. We are working on the Ciliwung River, which ends up here, but it begins in the volcanic mountains of Jawa. It is 90 kilometers long, and some work that I will show today is generated here. So we are right in the middle of the city, in an urban village, not completely a slum, which is called Kampung Melayu. Look at that picture. This is how the river looks in Kampung Melayu. all you see here is a man-made landscape. It is waste. So we call this lasagna, plastic lasagna.
Not
It is-
spaghetti.
Yes, it is lasagna. It's a mix of mud, shit, waste, and you don't want to know what. So if you want to work here in this kind of environment, you have to be prepared. So maybe you understand why I'm always saying that landscape architects who work there should be prepared, like she is, or look like him. For me, the technology comes second. What is the main thing that we have to care for when we work with digital media? It is the project itself, it is the content, it is the site. So I would like to talk in the beginning about the theater of operations, where I'm working with my colleagues and with my students. We are working behind the glitzy skyline of very large cities, a lot bigger than 10 million people, some of them even bigger than 20 million. We are doing that in Asia at the moment. If you look at this interesting map, some of you will know that. This is a map which is showing the overcrowded homes in 2005. And if you show it in an algorithmic map, then you see that here in Europe or here in America, there are not too many issues. But there is explosion in Asia. And so I'm here in Singapore, in the middle of that, and we are trying to profit from this situation. When we talk about urbanity, then this might not be the same thing as mega-urbanity. What you see in mega-urban settings is breathtaking. Well, look at this motorcyclist. He's wearing a gas mask. And he knows why he's doing that. Look at this guy. He is sitting in the Chilibung River, and he's fishing. This is a fish net. And look where he's fishing. So what he's doing, he's fishing the fish that we will cook 10 minutes after that. And this is a normal scene. I don't ask you to feel pity. It's just a standard scene. This is how these big cities are looking behind the facade, at the dark side of the city. The vehicles that we use are pretty funny. You see here a jeepney. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. This is a jeepney, which is a self-made car driving around in Manila, in the Philippines. Very dangerous, very funny. They have a very good sound system, and I bring the students to such landscapes. What you see here, this beach, the beach is not sand, it is waste again. This is next to a slum where people live who have great skills, and they build, for example, this ship that they will sell. It's incredible. When we saw this ship, we thought of this movie, Fitzgeraldo, this crazy guy, my preferred actor, Klaus Kinski, trying to pull this ship over the mountain. And what we did in this project, we combined the jeepney on land with the potential jeepney on the water. We put it on the water, which is a huge infrastructural project. This is the neighborhood where we started with that. This is where the people are living that we work with. In our studio, we produced this large map. We work on the whole river here, and you see that the metro systems are in a ring form. Also, all the roads are in a ring form, and the only shortcut would be the river. So, what we produce are landscape architectural projects which suddenly become infrastructure. The infrastructure has to be designed. This can be done by landscape architects. The boats have to be pimped. You see here the Jesus Christ Superstar boat. The water jeepney shall be built. This is the most recent prototype that we showed. We are working with a sponsor now, and I hope that we will build it very soon, the first prototype. My research that I'm doing currently in Singapore is called Grassroots GIS. I'm working with a little team. My visiting senior researcher is Philip Paul, that you also know very well. We are a couple that works a lot since many years together, so it's a kind of symbiosis of two people. We were starting at a time, well, you see here an animation of 2006 in a huge project called Lene 3D. It was about digital botany, that we call digital botany. We are really trying to produce botanical correct depictions of vegetation. You see here a very small scale, but it is made for a very large scale, so we could apply this kind of quality in a huge landscape. And I think it was a very successful work. You see here just a scene, all that is three-dimensional. This is not Photoshop, but this is a model. We started there, and we tried to bring technology back to the bottom. So the Lene 3D stuff was really sophisticated. We were working with young professors of IT. We were the landscape architects who needed these professors, and we had a good cooperation. But it was really absolutely specialist work. So it was too complicated to be taught easily to students. So the first time we were trying to take it out of our laboratory was a studio in Bangladesh in 2008. And the funny thing is, when you work in a country like that, there are no maps available. Even if you look at Google Earth, it's just a pixel soup. So we marked a city of 3 million people by 700-meter high palm trees to see it on the digital globe. And we made these kind of anticipatory models to have an idea how will it look maybe. We had some information, we could read the books, we had some images, and you see a model which was made before we went there. And it was interesting. We were pretty close to reality. You see a digital model here again in this linear 3D style, and you see a photograph of me, which shows that we were not so wrong. And when the students went to the field with us and worked on it, they produced design which then was even acknowledged with a prize, which I'm just showing to make clear that we are always interested in creating a result which is still design, and not that we are the digital guys and we're operating there and nobody's understanding what we do, but it must come to design finally. These are the fieldwork tools that we applied the first time in 2010 in Manila, and look how simple they are. So the most important tool might be the sunscreen. Digital camera, you see a GPS device. What we are doing, we are working in areas which never had been mapped. So what you see here on the Garmin device, there is no map laying beneath, because there is no map. So you cannot upload or download any map so far. So we really feel like explorers. Just to give you an example, a city of 16 million people, and this is in the center of the city. It's an island, or not a really island, it's a part of the harbor, and there are living 30,000 people in a slum. And when you look at Google Earth, then you see that exactly where these 30,000 people live, there is no mapping at all. And the most funny part is here in Bing Maps, this is even not existent, this island. So what we are doing, we are mapping that. We are uploading the maps, OpenStreetMap, so this is cost-free and it is available to anybody. So we are trying to do the first steps to start a project. These people suddenly get an address. When you design something, you need a plan. If others come, they can edit this map and work with that. So this is stuff that we made. It was a very successful design, finally. Now this place has an address, this place has a design, and again, there is a connection between the digital preparation and the mapping activity and the final design in the end. In 2011, there was a slight rearmament. We bought a better camera, that's all, and we worked with iPhone. So we tried to work with apps, successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but it's a wonderful tool. The interesting thing is every student, at least I guess here also, at least in Singapore, every student has an iPhone. So you really work with an everyday tool. You can do a lot of things with it, mapping. You see me here, for example, a driver cannot read a paper map. They don't read maps, they don't know how to read maps, but they can read my digital device when we are navigating through the city. This is just an example for the most detailed possibility to use it, to catch a color, for example. You might say, well, that's maybe not very, that doesn't make sense to catch that color. It does, because you see my students here working in house building projects and painting them afterwards. The paint plays a very important role. I'm just giving you this example to show which potential these tools have in the future. We were also working with panoramas. Well, you know that panoramas are very abstract still, but I just would like to cite this word for an article that we wrote afterwards. We would need an app for the creation of linear, long and flat panoramas, and that would be extremely helpful. It was not there at that time, but when we went to the field, back to the field in 2012 to work in Manila, this is our equipment that you see here. Still very harmless. This time we brought a Leica distometer, a newer generation of a Garmin device, and a pretty standard camera. So you see us here before we go in the field. This is Philip here in the forefront. We are calibrating our devices. All the students are using that. And then we are crawling through the slums. And it's interesting to see these devices are everyday tools, but we are creating very precise material with this. We are producing highly accurate cross-sections, pretty standard, but they are really accurate, so they are absolutely correct. And we are using our devices. You see me here with a bamboo pole, and you see here Philip crawling down. This is a 4-lane motorway bridge, and under this bridge, here, under it, here, are living 200 people. And their business is recycling. So what we are doing under this bridge, I just give you this example. We are producing point clouds, more or less. And when we have these point clouds, we can produce highly precise, 3-dimensional models of an awkward place. And what I would like to show, well, it will move a little bit. It's like a boat, sailor, sorry, but it has to do with the focal points. We couldn't take photos everywhere because we're standing in dead rats or other attractive places. But this is where the people live. When you go home with this material, you can really think on it. So it's an analysis that is really bringing home material that you cannot sketch, that you cannot only photograph, but you can understand spatially. What you see here are the columns under the bridge. So the people are living in 4 lanes. It's an incredible place. What you see here is a whole street, and it is at the same time a hill. When you are here, you are at the river edge, you are in the slum. When you are here, you are up the hill, and you are in a wonderful, beautiful garden, which is there since 3 generations. And this man who is living here comes back to the slum every weekend because he's living here in his garden. These are strange pictures, I know, but I would like to show you. This is a kind of standard cross-section. And you see, this is up at the hill. You go down into this street and down to the river. And all that is covered. You cannot see that from above. This is why we call ourselves foot soldiers. So there are roofs over it. The people who are living in this street have electric bulbs to have light there. Everything is wet. Water is dropping. It's incredible living conditions, but at the same time very fascinating to work with students there and my colleagues. And just to give you an impression, all that is 3-dimensional now, and we are now able to produce whole models of big sites when we mount them together. You look through that. This is where you come from, a staircase. Then you get into this covered space, and then you look through this alley here, you turn left, and down there's the river. It's looking like a battleship, I know, but it's pretty precise material. I'll show you an example. This is the photograph, and this is the 3D model, which I show you here. And the interesting part is we can measure the model in a super exact way now. So we bring back material which we use for design, which we didn't have the time for measuring all that in the field. So suddenly this tool becomes a true tool. So why taking these models? Because you can measure them afterwards. Centimeter or decimeter sharp. Just let me switch to this depiction here. This is the situation. You are here in the garden. This is where the man lives. This is the garden wall. You are looking into this alley here. And when the model is turning further, you can suddenly look into the alley, which is then going down into this underworld where we are working in. And this cannot be produced with flying devices. You just have to march in, and this is why we call ourselves foot soldiers. Why are we doing that? Because if you are down at the river or if you are up at the hill, it's deciding of the quality of living and the quality of space. So this is what we design in between, and this is what we are doing that. Well, it can be geo-tagged, it is placed on Google Earth, which is standard, and it becomes a part of the design process. So this odd-looking material suddenly can be built into the terrain model, and it is becoming a true part of the design. It's clear the next part in our research is how to influence, how to take up parts, take out, shift it, and really begin to design with that. But this is homework that we still have to do. And then the design begins. It's ongoing design work. I just showed you an inspiration. My last 5 slides shall be a short outlook, how I see the digital landscape now or maybe tomorrow. We absolutely, well, this is the famous phaser of Captain Kirk, yeah? And, well, he was an early bird, and we have really to work with these kind of devices. In Singapore, we are now buying this, or we bought it already, the far laser scanner. When you place it, it gives you a fantastic point cloud 3D model of whole space that you are scanning through. High precision GPS tools, quite expensive, but you need them if you're going into the field, like I showed you before. And this is the landscape architect of the future, naturally working with that. There is a whole army of drones flying towards us. I think that landscape architects have to think about that. You see here this military tool, but you see me here with a flying drone, which is looking pretty similar. This is in Singapore. The drone was brought to Singapore by Christophe Giraud. I'm working together with him in Singapore now. And so the foot soldier is now becoming an aviator. And if you combine these two methods of aviation and foot soldier, then you have perfect possibility to build incredible things. Another tool here, Toys for Thought. It's a helicopter with a high precision camera, which we also bought in Singapore. It's the ETH Zurich exchange project. And I definitely think that we will work with that. So this is not meant too serious here, this depiction. We have to play with possibilities to go into the field and apply these kind of tools. So this is my final slide. I think what we have to do in very good landscape schools concerning digital landscape architecture, we have to found certain landscape bases. Well, this is one of my most loved piece of art I've ever seen. Hans Hollein, this was already made in 1964 when he was putting this aircraft carrier into the landscape. And I think we have to work between this, well, this aircraft carrier is full of foot soldiers and aviators and students and teachers, and we have to develop this kind of digital army knife in a pretty playful way. Don't worry, I'm not a militarist. This comes already in the kampung where we work for. Look at these kids, they're playing with these kind of toys, and we also have to be very playful. So we have to play with these toys. It is fascinating for the students, it is fun for the faculty, and there's a lot of research that we can do in this field. Thank you very much.
We're still on.
It's like painted as flat.
Great. So I am definitely coming to this from the outside, but I've had a little bit of experience. I'm an artist, and last year I taught a course on animation and landscape here, and I usually teach animation at University of Pennsylvania, and I work with animation. My background is in painting, and then I sort of fell into video and computer animation. And I thought, wouldn't there be a way with computer animation to work with text and image, and then also to, I guess I'm talking about 1996 or 97, make something that I thought was beautiful, without having this sort of sense that I was struggling with realistic photo-representational kind of way of imaging. So the computer seemed to be really good at representing some things like mechanically made things, and then everyone was working with algorithms to try to represent everything in nature. My professors sort of were growing out of algorithmic music and algorithmic representation kind of ideas, and I thought, well, we already have this kind of if you scan, what blew me away was a flatbed scanner. Was if you scan a piece of paper and the scanner was good enough to pick up the grain of the paper, then there was this kind of complexity there that could be simulated by an algorithm. But then how could we sample that and then sort of use that as the raw material? It references something that's beyond what we can take in all at once. If you take a photograph and you start to zoom in and you analyze it, then you start to reflect on it. But if you generate it with an algorithm, then it doesn't sort of unravel in that same way. So a couple of examples. A couple of examples of my work. This is I'm going to go from most recent to past. This is a photograph of a road in Oregon, overlaid with a computer animated 3D scan of a model that I built. And so the model that I built by my hands was asymmetrical slightly, or it's just because of my error. And the model's about this big, but that's a 3D scan moving through the space. I have samples of these on my website, so in terms of seeing the motion, I kind of want to keep the focus to the overview. This is a 3D scan of a sculpture sort of inserted into an animated scene. In the background is animating, and the figure's animating. So there's sort of it's collage in a sense, but it's animated collage. This is a sculpture that's made from made by hand and then cast in bronze, and then scanned and then inserted into the same animation before. And one of the things I was thinking about in this was, in this right here, I reduced the resolution so there's a facet. I didn't have to, because the scan was high enough that there was a continuous surface. But then I thought, well, the difference between this model and this is that this bronze has an infinite amount of information, where the scan is a point cloud. It's a reduction, and the reduction is like a concept. It's like an idea. It's what you come back with when you go to the forest and you look at the forest. You have some notes in your head, and you sort of go back through those moments, but you don't have everything. Where when you have the original object, you have you can keep referring back to it, and you're dealing with the actual material. This is an animation in 2004. And I used puppets a bronze sculpture, and then a watercolor landscape in the background. The watercolor landscape is colored digitally, but it's made by hand. And in different shots of the animation, what I'm doing is I'm modeling it in Maya, printing it out on a laser printer, making watercolor drawings using the 3D animation, and then scanning them back in and then recycling them. Trying to find ways to deal with I think I have a background in drawing, but once I learned the tools of drawing with Maya in 3D space, and I felt comfortable with that, I couldn't bring myself back to actually trying to do something that I could do easier with the computer. But on the other hand, when I'm trying to get an idea out quickly, when I'm trying to lay out a sketch or get things out of my head so that I can get to the next step, then I use drawing for that. But in terms of representation, I haven't found it to be useful in the same way that it used to be. So this is one of those scenes where I've made it in Maya, it's animating, and then I'm printing it out and redrawing it. One of the things that I was thinking about, this is a charcoal background with a puppet in the front. The charcoal background is actually modeled in Maya, but then it's printed out, and then I make a bunch of charcoal drawings and replace them. The background has this sort of cycling pattern. And what happens, I didn't expect this, but what happened with this collage was that there was a displacement, sort of you read a displacement of when you're in an environment and you're having an internal thought process and the environment's moving. So there's some kind of, this collage gives this effect of being able to project yourself into the environment, but having the environment have some kind of separation, some kind of simultaneous kind of speed, but then you're static in a sense, and you're thinking, and you're receiving air movement, you're receiving all of these things. So the environment's moving, but the figure's static. In this, this is back in 2000, I was trying to represent water, and looking at painters through the 20th century, representations of water in different kinds of ways is just made with a simple mark, combinations of simple marks. So around the outside, I used an L-shape, just geometric shape, and they're moving like water, but they're not water. So one of the things that I was thinking about, and that I've been struggling with, that might translate. I mean, I don't know what's going to translate, so I'm interested in this, and I haven't known because I'm not as familiar. I'm not nearly as familiar with landscape architecture as anything as cinema, for example. But that I know there's a big difference between the experience that I have and the experience that is represented on a video camera when I look back at it. I know that. And I know that when I have an idea and then I make it in animation, and I look at the animation is different than the idea. So I know that the experience that we have and the experience that we imagine is not what we represent. There's a big gap. This is a still of an animation by Paul Fairlinger, who's someone I teach with, and he's been working for 35 or 40 years as a Czech animator, and he's really good at making animations where a still doesn't look nearly as good as the animation, because a lot of it's expressed through motion. So any particular still kind of doesn't hold up as a drawing. That's his opinion. But it's minimal. He has an experience doing this by hand, but he's using a Wacom tablet for this. This whole production is Wacom tablet. His wife does the background coloring, and he does the foreground, the line drawing. And so they work together as a team, and he's done feature films. So I wonder if if you can't see it, it's at the bottom. It says less detail equals greater engagement. Okay. So I think if you, it's kind of, I mean, maybe not with poetry. I mean, some people like poetry and some don't. Maybe there's something with this line drawing. The less that you provide, instead of adding more and more and more and more, if you pull back a little bit, maybe it gives a space for immersion. Maybe if you I know that through a simple gestural drawing, well, let's say this: when you're teaching figure drawing, and someone's representing the figure, the first or the second or the third line might be okay, because you can still kind of imagine the figure in there. That every time that they put down another line, it becomes more and more wrong. And there's a point where it looks terrible. And so it's about, we can project onto it more and more, we can immerse it. And then there's a point where the information becomes a little bit restrictive, if it's wrong. This is a hand-drawn animation that I've been working on. And I was imagining a fish, and then sort of the way that the water would move around a fish. But I thought that I would try to limit my representation of it, and sort of create a whole animation that sort of was in this level of detail. And then maybe just put it on a table and then photograph it in this way, so that it's actually what it is. There's this great article that I keep going back to. I think it was written about 4 years ago, about where this animator in Hollywood adjusted all of these images from Polar Express to make them look a little bit more human. And so there's a slide. The top one is Polar Express, and the bottom one is him like manipulating it in Photoshop to make it seem less creepy. And so one thing I've read is like there's this thing about pathogen avoidance. You can see it there. But just that the guy on the top looks a little sick, and if something's symmetrical, if it's a little bit off, then we kind of it's ugly to us. We want to move away from it. But my fish is like, this is like no other fish that I've ever seen before. Well, there it goes backwards, because I'm backwards. And what I'm thinking is if I purposely don't look at, in the past I've always looked at references. I've always looked at visual references and then sort of modeled off of them. And I'm thinking what I could do is do more simplistic representations and try to do it from the concept of the fish. I had an accident in my studio where I was trying out this new paper, and I put charcoal over there, and I put a big block of ink over here, and I was meant to spray fix on the charcoal, but it accidentally got on the ink, and it created all these holes, in it where it became a resist, and then it dried up in this kind of pattern of rings. And so then I did a full sheet of that problem, and I tried to animate it in this way. And I thought, well, if I'm going to put these things in order, maybe I should group them together, or see if it would sort of make a sequence. Because I can't intentionally make animation with this. It's just each one's going to come out differently. Then I got a residency at the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, and I told them that I would like to figure out how to make animation without preconceiving it, but by ordering, by resequencing. So we tried some things, and this is what happens when you make some kind of mixture with eggs and ink and things like that. There's a certain kind of pattern that it spreads out and it makes. So this is us doing this on a larger scale, and this is an egg with a pigment dropping ink in it and then dropping soap, and then it kind of expands out. To let this play out. So what I was trying to do is, and I was simultaneously thinking about the way that my 1.5-year-old, 2-year-old was learning words and hearing sounds, trying to categorize the sounds, and then understanding that it is a learning process, making multiple things, observing types, and then organizing them, and then using them to resynthesize was a learning process. So we made about maybe like couple thousand, I think just like 2,000 of them. And when they dried, they looked like this. They cracked up and they pulled away, and they were really pretty beautiful, but you couldn't move them because they were flaking off the paper because of the egg. And so then I photographed them, and I started to use Adobe Bridge, to organize them into types and see if I could get them to evolve and sort of synchronize with this soundtrack of my son trying to repeat the vowel sounds that I'm speaking. Then I thought I could take this further, so I went back to my studio and I started to make things, and I wanted to deal with color. And so I went back and I started using this same kind of paper, watercolor, and salt, because the salt had a different sort of pull-in thing, and I read that watercolors use salt. I gave up. I didn't realize, I couldn't figure out how to structure a project with that kind of experimental process. And I thought, well, I've never really given up before, but I completely gave up on it. So then, this was happening a little bit overlap with teaching the class here, and this is an example from the class that I'm going to just show.
There's a correlation between teaching the GSD and your first experience of giving up.
Yeah, GSD happened first. And so this is what you saw at the beginning of this was a photographic sort of sequence of moving through a space. It's not as sophisticated as on the foot, but then trying to break it apart. Well, that didn't really work. That was just, what are you going to do with that? You're going to get a slight movement or something like that. This is tracking motion. Maybe there's a way to think about sampling from the environment. Like you go to a place and there's different kinds of motions, and if you're not tuned into that, it's like being a composer not tuned into sound in some kind of environment. This is using the motion of the performer, the camera holder, to bring a little bit of spatial life to something. So this is pretty simple. In the box already stuff to track the motion of the camera of the holder. When you have some kind of architectural form that you can tap onto, and then putting a 3D model or animation into it. Yeah, 2 minutes. Okay. So this is 6 photographs that are looking back and forth on a tripod, and I've used this as a technique in a lot of my animation. This is 2 photographs that were taken a long time ago of Booker T. Washington. And it's a stereo photograph, but they're flipping back and forth, and just the alignment of it gives you a sense of space. This is a replacement animation using multiple drawings, and pixelation using performers in space. And there's an algorithmic animation that I'm a fan of, and this is a collage animation from 1918, Winsor and Kay. So then. My last idea, which I didn't know if it worked, but I'm kind of curious about it, was that rather than using a top-down map design, thinking about designing a space through the experience of a journey or a narrative structure. And this is from one of my Japanese students at Penn. He gave me the sort of chart that he had that he was really it was really important to him. Thinking about do the camera movement first, do the walkthrough first, and then build the set for the experience around it, rather than build the set and the environment and make the camera move through it. So I thought when I teach that, usually I refer to the Hollywood cinema tools, because part of the reasons that everybody's annoyed by the sort of moving fly-through spaceship walkthrough, the cinematic language that we're tuned into are the controlled movements, the circular track, the crane, limiting it to 2 or 3 axes, and then sequencing it in a certain way where you're going from wide shots to medium to close-ups and high to low. This is a piece called Snake River that's by Charles Gaines and Edward Arsenault that tracks the map of the river, the Snake River, with a musical piece, and then the way that it's shot I think it's the Red Cat Theater, is the way that it's shot is with motion control camera, matching the contour of the river. And what I'm working on now is I'm building this, trying to make an exact representation of the tennis court at Fontainebleau to do a puppet animation inside of it before it was renovated in 1990. And I'm building a motion control system that's connected to stop motion, so this is going to slightly move the camera in incredibly small increments, so I can have these kinds of fluid movements in and out of the courts, and deal with stop motion. But this is the kind of infrastructure of the court and pull off the infrastructure of the court. It's kind of going to have removable parts and things so I can shoot in and through it and around it as the players play this game, which is going to be the structure of the animation. The structure of the animation is the game. Every day I'll figure out what's going to happen in the point, and every night I'll shoot the point. And then that will create, hopefully it'll be as interesting as watching sports. That's it.
Great, thanks. Those are two quite compelling presentations. And I think it's my job to somehow sort through them. So I'll try. On the one hand, Jörg, I was fascinated by some of the tools that you were putting out to us. I mean, you very deliberately, by referring to yourselves as the foot soldiers as opposed to the aviators, were adding new dimensions to new inputs for geodesign practices. You are mapping things that aren't being mapped. And by doing so, you're giving value to things that have previously not had value, that haven't been registered. And I found that quite interesting. We had a presentation just a couple weeks ago by Charles with some of the point cloud, using some of the point cloud technology in a much different environment in the Swiss Alps, and began to see some of the potential for this incredible tool to add levels of detail and precision, and to allow for experiences of that, views of that, motion through those models in ways that you couldn't actually perceive as a person. And so there's something really quite compelling about levels of detail that we're getting from some of those tools. Your work, Josh, I was struck by a number of things. I mean, the kind of very simple ways you talk about moving between a kind of analog and a digital environment and back and forth. The inversion of how we perceive things or what's being perceived. I was looking at the number of your animations online, and the charcoal one, Electronica, was that the name of it, was quite compelling when you look at the animation because of the error, because of the slippage between one charcoal sketch and the other, there's a reverberation. And so in the same way that you were talking about, the environment was almost pulsing while the person was sort of just kind of moving through it. It was jarring. It was also, with most of these, I believe there are soundtracks too, which I understand you've had a hand in composing. So it's not just the visual that's being engaged, the audio is being engaged as well. As I was starting to prepare for what was going to come today, I looked back at the topic, and you brought up the issue of topic. And, is the topic good? Should we use it in a sense? So I began to look up, sensory sensing, issues of sense, and I went to the dictionary because that's all I know how to do, and began to just, look at words associated with the work that you were doing, particularly with sensory. I'm on the sensory media platform group, and we have meetings.
Two words about that for people who don't know
Sure.
what that's about.
At the school, you have a series of departments, and what the dean and administration have been trying to do is find topics that move across departments, that are common topics that we all share in and can speak to. So history theory is one, practice is one. I forget it. There's another one out there. Technology, sorry. Technology was one, and I sit on one called Sensory Media with Sylvia and Chris and Alan and Christoph. And I think for the first half of every meeting we argue about the word sensory and whether it should be there, what it is, and et cetera, et cetera. So I just went to the dictionary to figure out what the hell we're talking about. And the dictionary definition talks about the Latin root of sensory being to feel, to perceive, of or relating to sensation, or of the senses, conveying nerve impulses from the sense organs, the nose, the mouth, the eyes, the ears, the skin, to the nerve centers. So this relationship between what you sense and how your brain starts to process it. From that, I went back to sense itself to figure out, well, what is that about? Sensing. And again, the Latin roots talk about understanding, perceiving, feeling, etc. Talk about the faculty of receiving mental impressions through the action of sense organs of the body, perceiving changes in the condition of the body. So again, there's this relationship between what you feel, what you sense, what you hear, and cognition, imagination, I would say.
There's a minority position argument for temporal media, and then eventually the sensorial type said, sensory implies time.
I didn't look up temporal. Sorry. The next thing, of course, there are all these derivatives of sensory sensual, which is, of course, another one, again, perceived through the sensory apparatus, sensory extended to gratification of the senses, carnal, fleshy, right? So now we're getting into some good meat here, right? This is pretty cool. All right, so that's sense on the one hand. On the other hand, sensing, I was struck when we moved to sensing, all of a sudden the definition of sensing is the determination by observation of the location of a gunnery burst or center of impact in relationship to a target. Also announcement of such location. All of that. An incredibly militaristic standpoint on what this was about. And if you actually look up remote sensing, it talks about the scanning of the Earth by satellite, by flying aircraft in order to obtain information. And so again, when you move from sense to sensing, all of a sudden it's about the gathering of information, right? In this case, from a high-flying aircraft, but on the other hand, from what you're arguing now, from on the ground as well. And so I'm struck, really, as you begin to think of the etymology of these words, some of the different approaches to the work that I see you guys putting forward. I mean, on the one hand, a sort of measured, metered, targeted, fully analyzed model of collecting data, where, I'm not sure you said this, but it's almost as if the reality is the measure of the model. How good the model is how much it reflects reality, right? And on the other hand, Josh, you talked about the gaps, the things that were left out, the puddles in your first model of the toilet. You almost said, I want to go fill in those gaps, and I was thinking, actually, those gaps are beautiful because they leave a place for the imagination. And so I wonder if we can just have a discussion about these gaps, these overlaps. I mean, on the one hand, we could say, it's about sensory engagement. It's about a kind of militaristic attitude. Those are different viewpoints. Are there overlaps here? Are we fighting over the gaps? What do you think?
Well, I must admit, I'm also happy about these gaps. So it's when I say that we're working on these gaps, we have to work on these gaps. We have no choice. On the other hand, I like the dirtiness of the material. So I like the dirty imagery that we are producing. And I think that in the design process, what we call this dirty imagery is extremely important, because when it becomes too perfect, then you end up with this kind of photorealism, which again then is something which is looking unreal, which is promising something which is not there, and which is not very much loved anymore, I think. And I understand it, because, well, if you don't have abstraction, you cannot design. You need something like an in-between status. You cannot have the perfect thing. So that's why we're happy about this battleship at the moment happy about this battleship aesthetics that we're producing. On the other hand, we are happy to see those things that we really want to see. So it's a healthy mix at the moment for us to have a material which we bring back from the field, which is really, well, it's 50 times more detailed than we ever produced it before. But on the other hand, it is not reality. It's in between. And so this imperfectness is something that we appreciate and that we need. Otherwise, it would block us as designers, I guess.
This is where I don't know if my interest translates, but one of the things I've been curious about with animation is it's not animation when you look at it technically. It's just a series of pictures, and so what it does is it creates the space for you to put it together and see something as see something that actually isn't there in a sense. That it lets you recall motion that actually isn't there. One of the strangest phenomena that I've thought about is when you're in a film theater and you're watching a film. It's black and then it's light and then it's black and then it's light. So you recount the experience of 2 hours and only you've been in the dark for 1 hour and you've been in the light for another hour. The part that you're in the dark for is the part that you've sort of closed the loop. So it's a participatory kind of experience where you've closed the loop and you've made some kind of continuous picture out of something that's only partial. I don't know if that's required because you can also go into, if we developed a technology where it didn't go black, or we're looking at a projector that has a smaller and smaller kind of gap between the lights, which is I think what we're seeing now. But then you still put it together. But it's really assembling a bunch of smaller senses and then they come together. So you're doing that right job. I don't know if we have to think about that as part of our design, to think about the gaps, to think about what's left out, to think about because you never get a comprehensive kind of solution. You only build a number of observations.
But it seems for you that the gap becomes an opportunity to think, to speculate, to design in a sense. That the accident all of a sudden leads to, how many did you say, 5,000 ink spot diagrams is a way to begin to open up a line of inquiry. Right? And so the gap becomes very productive for you.
And maybe to develop a process that limits you from representing everything. That leaves, because I mean that's what makes it sort of inspiring to keep going. It's the open river that makes you wonder about that kind of, could you represent everything? And but then at the same time you have, I think that you have to have, maybe the way that you started, there has to be the reason to represent. There has to be that kind of thing at the very beginning to know what you want to represent and what's not important. It's kind of an editing process from the very beginning. Picking the tool is an editing process of what you want to capture and what you want to, and where you want the person who's going to engage with it to connect the circle and
Here, maybe you could pick up on that in terms of how the information that's being put together, that's being packed together, becomes the kind of prompt, becomes what's the next step in the design process for you. I mean, Andy was asking a question a couple of weeks ago of Giraud to say, we have the tools now to add increasing levels of detail, more information. Does that get us somewhere further than where we were before?
Yes, I think so. Well, especially in the context, the work I show is happening in an informal city. And it's happening in a well, it is happening in a situation which others would describe as chaotic, but it is not chaotic, it is highly organized. And for example, if we work with these cross-sections, it is one way to begin to understand a merely incomprehensible situation when you're coming from outside. And you need something that you bring home. If you don't bring that home, then you end up with a total, completely shallowness, which, well, I know what I'm talking about. I mean, this happens sometimes, and we have the feeling that now we are beginning to have really opportunities to bring back material into the studio, which is really giving us the opportunity to do the right thing. I think this is the big progress at the moment, that before, if you compare that, if you have asked me, could you build such a crazy, strange-looking model 3 years before, then it was not possible. It was not possible, but we needed it as we need it now. And so this is what I think is the kind of surplus value. We are far beyond of perfectionism. We are really far beyond of any perfectionism. But this spatial composition that you bring back was definitely not there before, but you needed to be a spatial designer. And if I compare that with the two-dimensional stuff that we were all working with all the time, then I personally see the progress. And I don't want to get back to the kind of half-blindness that I know very well, especially in the super complex structure of the informal world, because, well, it's difficult to understand, and you have to really reflect on it for a long time. And if you bring back a piece of this cake, in whatever form, then it is extremely helpful for a rational design decision.
In that regard, I mean, both presentations, both bodies of work have as much to say about the field. You know, I mean, when we discussed this, we thought it would be interesting, and I think of both Georg and Josh's work as really revising and unpacking and extending these two dominant paradigms. But what I'm coming away with is that they both have a very, very different relationship to going into the field. I mean, Josh, in your practice, you never leave the studio, it seems. I mean, I know that you go on site, you expose photographs, but there is really a kind of construction of these historical, narrative-based worlds in West Philadelphia, which is very different than using technology to go out and capture the world.
May I add one thing to this field? Well, I think this kind of field where these topics like field operations and these kind of vocabulary that we always depended on as designers. So without no field work or touching the field, well, landscape architecture is totally lost. And I think that this combination of having really kind of massive field work, where we go is really, well, it's really the most extreme places that you can visit. But on the other hand, you go back to the safety of the university to work on it intellectually. So this combination is something, and in between you have this digital stuff. And I think this is something which is really bringing new methods into the studio also, and I think
we're going to open it up for questions. But it occurs to me that one of my anxieties, one of my causes for concern about the general trajectory of verisimilitude. Stephen showed this incredible drawing of these vertical lines that are registered XY coordinates with triangles that could stand for an entire ecosystem. That intellectual tradition, the thing that gives me pause about it, among other things, is that it does depend upon this increasing level of detail and accuracy about modeling the world, and it tends to then double down landscapes embeddedness and site specificity. And I think we can talk about that as an intellectual tradition. From the point of view of other cultural forms, landscape's dependence upon site as the referent, can I put it that way, is very different than the architectural tradition, in which the ability to work on site or not, or to have an autonomy vis-a-vis site or sightedness, I think has given architecture one of its greatest avenues for investigation, particularly the digital area. And I think we'll hear more about that over the course of the day. But I think this dependence upon site as the kind of as the definitive reference in the intellectual tradition of verisimilitude leads to the kinds of things that are really compelling these days and the kinds of things that you're showing about environments. But it tends to increase our embeddedness in which our authority as a field doesn't come from the kind of autonomous cultural production, critical production, as it does in architecture or urbanism, but rather it's from its externalities.
So we're going to open for discussion.
Can I just build on that? I think that was like an amazing articulation of this issue. Maybe that I want to ask the two of you: how do you keep it open and in a way that it can become a, say, design tool? Let me just back up into that. I mean, incredible presentations, really inspirational. But let's say, from a design point of view, so much of these kind of mapping, scanning, archiving exercises. One other way to articulate this is that you're always, let's say, reinforcing some grid. You're literally mapping points and so forth. And a lot of the kind of abstract models that have become very, let's say, inspirational to, and I'm talking about mathematics and geometry as design tools to emerging body of designers, have a kind of have a way to interface with the world, but also have a way to not. So how do you make these designs? How do you turn these methods into design tools? How do they come out of this kind of specificity and into a kind of like an ether where they can become many things? I mean, I could ask it in many kind of different ways, but I'm just wondering how it stays open.
Well, I'm not sure if this. You mean so that it's something that could be applied in practice?
Yeah, and say reused, reanimated. Let's say, for instance, in your work, that 2,000 isn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
How do you become? How would you be able to reorganize it to make 1 million? Maybe that's enough. Do you know what I mean? How does it become beyond let's say, something that can be, say, reanimated, reapplied, retooled?
Well, I mean, I think that at some point you start to need to make software, or people do to stronger tools. I mean, one of the things is this latest project with this tennis court is not. I haven't found a good. They won't reply to me with good architectural maps. So I've been using Flickr photographs, people's casual photographs, people's casual videos, and pulling stills from it and trying to use Photoshop's pretty weak tools to measure and build this entire landscape using photographs not. And so I have a couple of dimensions to go off, and then everything else is proportional to that. And someone just uploaded a couple more photographs, and I realized I was completely wrong about something else. It's another dimension. I know that there's software development in terms of analyzing photos and pulling out information. It's probably, and then it's these connecting tools that makes it, that puts it into practice. And we can do it. Some of the kinds of experimentation we can do that generate the need for software, and then we need to work with people to develop the software, and then we can go to the next step. I've worked with some engineering students, computer science engineering students, especially when they're sort of in their senior year or something, and they have a project that they need to do, but they don't know what to do. That's the situation that a lot of computer scientists sort of get themselves into, is that they want to know what the need is at that moment. And if we can kind of define it, we can articulate it, and then sort of put them on it, we can develop new tools that will let us put things into production, I think. And I've done it with sound, trying to not just visualize amplitude of sound, but tone, and then use tone to kind of adapt it to form if there was. And it's like a tool that we don't have right now, but it's the one. But we can. I think the kind of experimentation we can do can sort of generate the need for tools, and then we can find what they are.
I have two questions.
You want to try answer?
Oh, sorry.
Well, very short answer. I understand the question. Well, analysis, for the sake of analysis, is one of the biggest traps, I think, in every design process. But, well, in our case, in my case, the work that I show, I'm pretty relaxed because, well, this is applied for the as-is state. And, well, no design without understanding the as-is state. And because we are really in the field, we are searching for problems. And we invest a lot of time to identify these problems. And even if there are 10,000 problems, we maybe jump on one real issue and trying to solve it. For me, there is this benchmark. If we have one success in such an environment, then it's already a huge thing. Yeah? Doing something significant in a megacity is nearly impossible. And if you do it, then you can be really happy. So the digital work that I was showing here today is really related to the as-is state. And you need it to become an active designer. So the research that we are investing from here on is in exactly that point. How do you grab things and change them, or remove them, or throw them away and replace them? I think we are very aware of that thing, but we constantly speak out this warning. No analysis for the sake of
So I just have two very brief questions. Joshua, you mentioned this important distinction in the selection of media, which starts to allude to the differences between software, technology, and media as being not necessarily distinctive, but important to understand the differences between them. So I just was wondering, how do you approach that? Because in many respects, we spend a lot of time understanding how to be able to translate software, how to use it, but also there's another dimension that you're speaking of in terms of multimedia and understanding of the selection of media itself as that decision as being part of the design process. And so, and then one question for Jörg is, in terms of the degrees of precision that we're reaching, in terms of the very articulate way in which you explained the high order and high logic of informal, non-formal, or even slum-like conditions as being extremely designed. One question is it leading us towards understanding how to intervene, or is it enabling us as designers to be less as interveners and more as enablers of providing information for them to enter into a formal economy? So I wonder whether or not it's leading to more design, more intervention, or whether or not it's actually providing information to be able to share with them, to be able to use and almost continue to enter into formal urban economies.
Shall I?
Yeah.
Well, it's an excellent question. I think we are trying to use it for both. For example, we're producing our material and we are working with our material as designers, but what we do at the same time, we're not flying in and then flying out and doing it and up into the drawer. So we bring this back into the field and we inform the people who are living there about our reflection. And then we need them again to reflect on what we reflected on, and then we will go back to the studio. So what you see here is the beginning of a very long iterative process. And so this is why I say I think it's both. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's interesting. I give you an example. we are working on this river, and we are crossing the river by rafts, not by the toilet raft, but by other rafts. And we had a guide, and we said, well, let's go on the raft. And it's really dangerous to take this raft because you can fall into the river. The river is not water, the river is brown shit. Yeah? And so we crossed the river, went into another part of the kampung, and suddenly the guy who was crossing the river stopped, and he didn't move anymore. He was living 30 years on one side of the river, and he never crossed the river. Okay? So I give you this example. When we make a model of both sides of the river, it is really informing people who are living there since 30 years, and suddenly they are understanding, well, we are living in the low-lying areas, and this is why we have this kind of dirty slum there. And we have this terrain, we have this kind of topography, so we are happy because we are living high and dry in a way. And this is, I think this is, maybe it's a certain, maybe it's an example to answer your question. It is for us, but it's also for those who we are designing for. That's what we try at least.
Joshua, you might want to read the...
Yeah, I think if you can clarify that a little bit, it was about the choices of media and software.
That's right, because there seems to be a convention. There seems to be a convention, even sometimes confusion, that teaching software is actually about understanding how to be able to design with media. There's, and I know this could be a really long conversation, but clearly you just pitched a few minutes ago the importance of the decision of media or multimedia in order to either represent, produce, enact, create content, and in many respects, how would you approach that as a critique to the way in which software is introduced as a tool, and sometimes though confuses media, software as being media, as just an instrument, just as a tool, just as a hammer, as opposed to understanding it in terms of a much more, I think, even semiotic level that you're approaching in your work.
I guess I agree. I mean, I think I get what you're arguing for, and I agree that it's hard to, when you're teaching with software, it's very difficult to teach something that like I said, the tool gets developed because we have this need. So in Photoshop, it gets developed to crop the photo and to rotate the photo and color correct the photo. So it's difficult to not think about issues of photography when you're using Photoshop in a sense, or images. You have rectangular images, not round ones, and they have defined sizes and so on. So Maya is the character animation. It's difficult to give an abstract assignment that doesn't deal with the sort of the tools of skeletons and things like that. As soon as it's built into that. But the media has if you're able to work with something that's quite limited, then you see that it has attributes that are specific to it. And if you work with something where the problem is that when I do these things, like when I make an animation where there's a character and there's another media behind it, at the time that I make it, I don't understand that I didn't know that it was going to make the character seem, have an internal perspective, and that the environment was going to go backward and start to do this. It's kind of, that happened through an experimentation and then looking at and describing what the qualities of that were specific to that medium are. So I think that it happens through, in a way, critique. It happens through the discussion, and if the discussion points to if the discussion doesn't forget that the way that it's made, or the tool that made it, had an implicit effect on the way that it was expressed, and also the way that the design was shaped. If the critique says that, even if it's obvious, I think the critique has to say that even if it's obvious. That's the thing. If you make in the platform show, there are some modular structures that are 3D printed. When reason to do that would be that it's expensive to 3D print the whole thing, or that modular design is cost effective. But it's probably a little bit of both in some cases. If you can break it down into smaller parts and cast it out of plastic, then it has this effect, but it also creates the problems.
It's also really difficult to 3D print a building.
Yeah, so, I mean, but...
Or landscape.
Or landscape, but the idea of, I mean, the idea, the limitations of fabrication has created this kind of sense that you make parts that are modular and universal. So that's part of it. It's part of the restriction. So the overall architecture and design of it is somewhat being influenced by the tools that have been involved. It's a circular process, I guess. I don't know if that's addressing it right, though.
I think that's a good way to end the session.
Can I add just a little small point? No.
Please.
Please. No, I share your concern with the trajectory of kind of verisimilitude. I don't need that. But with the trajectory of verisimilitude. But I think like working with a point cloud model is actually very freeing because we spend so much time trying to describe sight that if you can like capture it and have it there as this ethereal, nebulous thing, and you've already had that comfort in having sort of described it and being able to refer to it, I feel like it gives you a kind of freedom.
Yeah, I mean, I think both York's presentation of the informal, but also what Christoph showed of these kind of highly complex infrastructural and natural environments. What's potentially freeing, and I agree with this, the level of modeling that's available, because it does give away the idea of modeling the entirety of the planet. And I do think that it does give away that profitably so, because it's then back georeferenced to other networks and other forms of knowledge. That combined with the level of resolution, I do think, as we were saying 2 weeks ago, it is a substantive distinction from that tradition. And I think it's worthy of study right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Joshua, Chris.